When a corrupt sheriff in a small town falsely accuses a black teenager, Devin Mitchell, of a crime he didn't commit, the case becomes a disturbing example of systemic racism in America. The sheriff's blatant abuse of power, including planting evidence and targeting vulnerable community members, sends shockwaves through the town. Dr. Malcolm Hayes, a powerful and respected CEO, returns to confront the injustice, exposing deep-seated prejudice and corruption. As tensions rise, Malcolm faces resistance, threats, and a rigged system determined to protect its own, forcing him to fight for justice in a town divided by racism. The morning light filtered through the cracked blinds of the apartment, casting faint golden streaks across the room. Ava Harper sat at the small kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee. Her gaze lingered on the stack of letters beside her, eviction notices, overdue bills, and one final reminder about the court date she couldn't afford to miss. For Ava, life had always been a delicate balance, a tightrope walk without a net. But today, the rope had frayed. Her son, Leo, shuffled into the kitchen, his backpack slung over one shoulder. At just 9 years old, his hazel eyes already carried the weight of a world he barely understood. "Mom, do you think they'll be there again today?" he asked, his voice quiet but laced with fear. Ava's chest tightened. She forced a smile, trying to mask the turmoil inside her. "No, sweetheart, they won't. Don't worry." Leo nodded, though the shadow of doubt lingered in his expression. The "they" he referred to weren't bullies on the playground. They were the officers who had begun circling their building, hassling residents, and leaving a trail of fear in their wake. Officer Trent, in particular, seemed to take pleasure in pushing boundaries, his badge a weapon against those he deemed powerless. Ava had seen it firsthand last week. It was the single mother in 3B, accused of squatting despite having lived there for years. Before that, the elderly man in 2D, forced to prove his citizenship. And now, it seemed, they had turned their attention to her. Her late rent and struggling household, an easy target. "I'll walk you to school," she said, rising from the table. She ruffled Leo's hair gently, her touch lingering, as if it could shield him from the uncertainty of the day. The walk to the school wasn't long, but every step felt heavier than the last. As they rounded the corner, Ava's stomach twisted at the sight of Officer Trent's patrol car idling near the building's entrance. He leaned against the hood, arms crossed, a smirk playing on his lips as his eyes followed Ava and her son. "Morning, Ms. Harper," he drawled, his tone dripping with mock cordiality. "Out for a stroll?" Ava ignored him, her grip on Leo's hand tightening. "Hey, I'm talking to you," Trent called out, his voice sharper now. She stopped and turned, her jaw clenched. "I'm taking my son to school. Is there a problem, officer?" Trent chuckled, taking a step closer. "Not yet, but you never know with folks like you. Paperwork can get lost, mistakes can happen. Just doing my job." Ava felt the heat rise in her face, but she forced herself to remain calm. "We're late," she said firmly, turning away. Leo's small hand squeezed hers as they continued walking. "It's okay, Mom," he whispered. But it wasn't okay. It hadn't been okay for a long time. As Ava watched her son disappear into the school building, she made a silent promise to herself. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about Leo, about the future he deserved, and about every person who had ever been forced to bow under the weight of fear. By the time she got home, her mind was made up. The world might be against her, but she wasn't going to let it win. She'd fight. She just needed to figure out how. And when her phone buzzed later that afternoon with a call from someone she hadn't heard from in years, Ava realized the fight might be closer than she thought. The low hum of conversation filled the diner, the clatter of silverware and hiss of the coffee machine blending into a symphony of small-town life. Dr. Malcolm Hayes sat in a corner booth, his large hands wrapped around a ceramic mug. Despite the modest setting, his presence commanded attention. Even if no one openly acknowledged it, he had the kind of quiet authority that didn't require raised voices or grand gestures. At 52, he carried himself with the confidence of a man who had spent decades proving people wrong. Malcolm adjusted the cuffs of his well-worn denim shirt, the fabric rolled up to reveal a sleek watch that glinted faintly in the fluorescent light. He didn't dress to impress here, not in Redford, where appearances were a minefield. His wealth and influence, CEO of one of the state's largest non-profit hospital networks, were irrelevant in a place where old prejudices ran deep and subtle slights spoke volumes. The town of Redford was one of those places that clung stubbornly to its image of itself as idyllic, a facade thinly masking decades of unspoken tension. The murals downtown celebrated a history that conveniently glossed over the hard truths of exclusion and marginalization. Malcolm, born and raised here, knew that history intimately. He had worked harder than anyone should have to escape it, but now, after years of building a life elsewhere, he had returned, not out of nostalgia, but out of duty. His mother had always said, "You can't fix a broken roof from the ground." And while Malcolm didn't quite believe he could fix Redford's cracks, he knew he couldn't walk away from them either. "Refill, Dr. Hayes?" asked a young waitress, her voice tentative. Her name tag read Ellie. She couldn't have been more than 20, her nerves betrayed by the slight tremor in her hand as she poured. "Please, and thank you," Malcolm said, flashing her a warm smile. Despite her unease, Ellie returned the smile. Malcolm had that effect on people. A disarming kindness that softened their edges. He glanced out the window as Ellie moved on. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the parking lot, where a few trucks and sedans were scattered. His gaze lingered on a sleek black car, a Bentley, a stark contrast to the battered vehicles surrounding it. Malcolm hadn't wanted to bring the car, but his assistant had insisted. "You've earned the right to show up how you want," she had said. He took a sip of his coffee, letting the bitter warmth spread through him. It was decent, better than he'd expected for a diner that hadn't updated its decor since the 1970s. He was here waiting for an old friend, Pastor Charles Tillman, who had called that morning with urgency in his voice. Charles had refused to elaborate over the phone, but Malcolm had learned long ago to trust the man's instincts. As the minutes ticked by, Malcolm's thoughts wandered. He thought of the meeting he'd had earlier that week with the hospital board, where he'd pushed through a policy expanding free healthcare to underserved communities. He thought of his teenage daughter, Olivia, who had recently written an impassioned essay on systemic inequality that had gone viral. He thought of Redford itself, and whether his mother would have been proud of what he'd accomplished, or angry that he hadn't done more. The sound of the diner door swinging open snapped him out of his reverie. Charles entered, his tall frame stooped slightly as if carrying the weight of his congregation's troubles on his back. His gray suit was impeccably pressed, his leather Bible tucked under one arm. He spotted Malcolm immediately and made his way over, extending a hand as he approached. "Malcolm," Charles said, his voice rich and resonant. "Thanks for meeting me." "Always," Malcolm replied, standing to shake his hand. "You sounded serious." Charles slid into the booth across from him, glancing around the diner as if to ensure they weren't being overheard. "It is serious," he said, lowering his voice. "I'll get straight to it. Do you know about the Mitchell case?" Malcolm frowned, the name sparking recognition. "The teenager accused of stealing a car?" Charles nodded. "That's the one. The trial's tomorrow, and I need your help." "Help how?" Malcolm asked, leaning forward. Charles hesitated, his eyes scanning Malcolm's face as though measuring how much to say. "I need you to testify, not as a character witness, but as someone who can speak to what this town's justice system really looks like." Malcolm exhaled, his mind racing. The Mitchell case had been all over the local news, a story that seemed tailor-made to stoke division. 17-year-old Devin Mitchell, a star athlete with a promising future, had been arrested for allegedly stealing a car from the wealthiest family in Redford. The evidence was thin, a set of fingerprints that could have come from anywhere, but the narrative had already been written. "You know they're going to come for me if I do this," Malcolm said. "This town doesn't like when someone challenges its image." Charles leaned back, his expression resolute. "I know, but if someone like you, someone they can't dismiss, stands up, it could make all the difference." Before Malcolm could respond, the bell above the diner door jingled again, and 3 men walked in. Malcolm recognized 2 of them immediately, Sheriff Branson and Deputy Kyle Nash. The third man was unfamiliar, but the way he carried himself, with an air of entitlement that seemed to fill the room, told Malcolm everything he needed to know. Branson's eyes locked on Malcolm, and a slow smile spread across his face as he sauntered over. "Dr. Hayes," he drawled, his voice as oily as ever. "Didn't expect to see you here." "Sheriff," Malcolm replied evenly, keeping his tone polite but firm. Branson looked at Charles, his smile widening. "Pastor Tillman." "Still stirring the pot, I see." Charles didn't flinch. "Just doing the Lord's work." Branson chuckled, a sound devoid of humor, and turned his attention back to Malcolm. "You know, it's funny a man like you, with all your money and connections, coming back to a place like this, makes you wonder why." Malcolm met his gaze without blinking. "Maybe I just like good coffee." Branson's smile faltered for a split second before he regained his composure. "Well, enjoy it while you can. Some of us have real work to do." The three men moved to a booth on the other side of the diner, but their presence lingered like a bad taste in the air. Charles leaned in, his voice low. "You see what I mean? They think they own this town." Malcolm nodded, his mind made up. "Tell me what you need." Charles smiled faintly, a mixture of gratitude and relief. "You're going to be a problem for them, Malcolm. The kind of problem they can't ignore." As Malcolm sat back, sipping his coffee, and watching the sun dip lower on the horizon, he felt the weight of what was coming. Redford wasn't just a town, it was a battleground. And the fight was far from over. This section introduces Dr. Malcolm Hayes, a powerful, yet humble protagonist, while establishing the tension and systemic challenges in Redford. It also lays the groundwork for the brewing conflict, positioning Malcolm as a reluctant but resolute force for change. Let me know when you're ready to proceed. The early evening cast long shadows over Redford as Dr. Malcolm Hayes parked his Bentley outside the town courthouse. Its polished black exterior reflected the fading sunlight, a sleek anomaly in a lot filled with battered trucks and modest sedans. Malcolm stepped out, adjusting the cuffs of his blazer. He wasn't dressed to impress, just a tailored suit and understated tie, but even here, his presence exuded authority. The courthouse itself was a relic of another time. Its stone facade was weathered but imposing, its history woven with stories of injustice disguised as law. Malcolm had been here only once before as a teenager, escorting his mother when she testified in a zoning case that pitted the predominantly black neighborhood against developers looking to tear it down. He still remembered the way the eyes of the room lingered on her, questioning her right to speak. Now, decades later, Malcolm walked through the courthouse doors, the weight of those memories fresh in his mind. Inside, the atmosphere was sterile, tinged with the faint scent of old paper and coffee. A few people milled about, their voices low, the acoustics amplifying every creak of the wooden floors. Malcolm headed toward the clerk's office, where he planned to review some of the public records tied to Devin Mitchell's case. He was determined to understand every angle before testifying tomorrow. At the counter, a young woman glanced up, her glasses perched on the bridge of her nose. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone polite but clipped. "Yes," Malcolm said, placing his hands on the counter. "I'd like to review the public filings for the Mitchell case." She blinked, her expression shifting slightly. "Are you an attorney?" "No," Malcolm replied. "I'm—" Before he could finish, her attention flicked to something, or someone, behind him. Malcolm turned slightly to see Sheriff Branson striding toward the desk, his deputy Kyle Nash a step behind. "Well, well," Branson said, his voice carrying through the room. "Dr. Hayes, you lost?" "No," Malcolm replied evenly. "Just doing a bit of research." Branson stopped a few feet away, close enough to make his presence felt, but far enough to maintain the illusion of casual interest. His eyes swept over Malcolm, lingering on his tailored suit and polished shoes, before locking on his face. "Research for what?" "I'd like to understand the details of Devin Mitchell's case before tomorrow's hearing," Malcolm said calmly. "It's public record, isn't it?" Branson's lips twisted into a smirk. "Public record, sure. But it's not every day we see a man like you poking around here. Don't you have a hospital to run?" Malcolm held his ground, his voice steady. "I believe in being informed, something you, as an officer of the law, should appreciate." The smirk faltered for a moment, replaced by a flicker of irritation. Branson leaned closer, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial tone. "Listen, Hayes, I know you think you're here to make a statement, but Redford doesn't need a savior. The system works just fine without you trying to play hero." Malcolm's jaw tightened, but he refused to rise to the bait. "If the system worked fine, we wouldn't be having this conversation." Deputy Nash, who had been silent until now, chuckled softly. "You know, it's funny. A guy like you, with your money and your Status. Coming down here to stick your nose where it doesn't belong. What are you trying to prove? Malcolm turned his gaze to Nash, his calm demeanor unshaken. I don't need to prove anything, but I do believe in accountability. The word hung in the air, sharp and deliberate. Branson's smirk returned, though this time it didn't reach his eyes. Well, good luck with that, but you might want to remember, things don't always go the way you think they will. With that, he turned on his heel, motioning for Nash to follow. The two men strode out of the room, their boots echoing against the floor. Malcolm exhaled slowly, willing his frustration to subside. He had dealt with men like Branson his entire life, men who saw his success as a threat, and his calm defiance as an affront. But the stakes were higher now, and he couldn't afford to let them rattle him. Excuse me, the clerk said softly, drawing his attention back to the counter. I can get you those records, it'll just take a minute. Thank you, Malcolm said, offering a faint smile. As she disappeared into the back office, he let his eyes wander. The courthouse lobby felt both suffocating and expansive, its high ceilings and narrow hallways an odd juxtaposition. The walls were adorned with plaques commemorating past officials, their portraits almost exclusively white and male. A nearby bench was occupied by a young mother, trying to soothe a crying baby, her expression weary but patient. It struck Malcolm how much this building represented power, control, and the unspoken rules that governed a place like Redford. He had fought his way into spaces like this before, but it never got easier. The tension, the stares, the microaggressions, all of it was designed to remind him that he didn't belong. Not really. When the clerk returned with a folder of documents, he thanked her and took a seat at a small table near the window. He opened the folder and began to read, his practiced eye scanning for inconsistencies. What he found was both infuriating and unsurprising. Vague witness statements, contradictory timelines, and an utter lack of substantial evidence tying Devin to the crime. He was so absorbed in the documents that he didn't notice someone approaching until they cleared their throat. Looking up, he saw a man in a crisp suit standing over him. His features were sharp, his expression carefully neutral. Dr. Hayes? The man asked. Yes? I'm Martin Ward, he said, extending a hand. Attorney for the prosecution. Malcolm shook his hand, noting the firm grip. Mr. Ward. Ward took a seat across from him, setting down a slim briefcase. I couldn't help but notice your interest in the Mitchell case. It's an important case, Malcolm said simply. Ward tilted his head, studying Malcolm. It is. And I'm sure you understand how delicate these matters can be. Malcolm raised an eyebrow. Delicate? Is that what we're calling a teenager being railroaded by circumstantial evidence? Ward's expression remained neutral, but his tone cooled. With all due respect, Dr. Hayes, I'm not sure you have the full picture. Then enlighten me, Malcolm said, leaning forward. Because from where I'm sitting, this case looks like a textbook example of bias. Ward hesitated, his polished demeanor faltering for the briefest moment. I understand your concern, but this isn't about bias, it's about justice, and justice requires following the evidence. Malcolm's voice remained calm, but there was an edge to it now. Justice requires fairness, Mr. Ward. It requires examining the motives behind every action, every assumption. Can you honestly say that's been done here? Ward stood, smoothing the lapels of his suit. I appreciate your passion, Dr. Hayes. But passion doesn't win cases, evidence does. Have a good evening. As Ward walked away, Malcolm felt a surge of frustration, his composure threatening to crack. He looked down at the documents spread before him, each page a reminder of the uphill battle he was about to face. He gathered the papers and returned them to the folder, his movements deliberate. Tomorrow he would testify, tomorrow he would make them listen. But tonight, as he stepped out into the cool night air, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The courthouse lights flickered behind him as he walked to his car, their dim glow a faint beacon in the growing darkness. The fight ahead loomed large, but Malcolm Hayes had never been one to back down. The morning air was heavy with an unseasonable humidity as Dr. Malcolm Hayes approached the courthouse steps. A small crowd had gathered, their murmurs filling the space like a low hum. Malcolm wasn't expecting this. Not the news vans parked strategically along the street, or the knot of protesters holding hand-painted signs. He recognized a few faces in the crowd. Pastor Charles Tillman was there, along with Devin Mitchell's mother, Carla. Her expression, equal parts gratitude and fear. Malcolm adjusted the lapels of his blazer, his steps deliberate as he climbed the stairs. He could feel the weight of their stares, some hopeful, others skeptical, a few openly hostile. "Dr. Hayes," a reporter called out, microphone in hand. "Do you think your testimony will change the outcome of the case?" "Dr. Hayes, is the Mitchell family paying you to speak today?" Another voice shouted, this one sharp with insinuation. Malcolm didn't break stride. His focus was on the courthouse doors, on the task ahead. He had been brought in to testify, not just as a prominent community leader, but as someone who could cut through the veneer of impartiality the prosecution had tried to maintain. His job was to expose the deeper rot beneath. Inside, the courthouse was buzzing with activity. Malcolm spotted Sheriff Branson near the back, speaking in low tones to Deputy Nash. They glanced in his direction, their expressions unreadable. Malcolm straightened his posture, refusing to let their presence unsettle him. Charles caught up with him just before he entered the courtroom. "They're rattled," the pastor said quietly. "They didn't think you'd actually show up." Malcolm offered a faint smile. "Then they underestimated me. That's their first mistake." Charles nodded, but didn't look reassured. "Be careful in there. They're playing dirty." Malcolm stepped into the courtroom, the din of the hallway fading behind him. The space was small and austere, its wooden benches filled with spectators who craned their necks to watch him take his seat. The prosecution's table was flanked by Martin Ward and a younger attorney, both of whom wore expressions of cool confidence. At the defense table sat Devin Mitchell, his shoulders hunched as if trying to make himself smaller. His public defender whispered something in his ear, but the teenager's eyes remained fixed on the table in front of him. Malcolm's seat was near the front, positioned where the jury could easily see him when he spoke. As he settled in, the judge, an older white man with thinning hair and a stern demeanor, called the court to order. The morning's proceedings were slow and meticulous, with Ward methodically presenting evidence that Malcolm had already scrutinized and found lacking. The prosecution's witnesses, a store clerk and a neighbor who claimed to have seen Devin near the car, gave hesitant, inconsistent testimony that Malcolm suspected had been rehearsed, but not well enough. By the time Ward called Malcolm to the stand, the tension in the room was palpable. "Dr. Hayes," Ward began, as Malcolm took his oath and seated himself, "thank you for joining us today. You're a busy man, aren't you?" Malcolm met Ward's gaze evenly. "I make time for what matters." Ward smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Of course, and you've been following this case closely, haven't you?" "Yes," Malcolm said. "It's important. Important enough for you to review public records, attend meetings, and, as I understand it, speak with members of this community about the defendant." Malcolm nodded. "Yes. Devin Mitchell is part of this community, and this case affects all of us." Ward tilted his head, feigning curiosity. "But Dr. Hayes, you're not a legal expert, are you?" "No," Malcolm said. "I'm a medical professional, but I've spent my career addressing systemic issues, and I understand the importance of looking beyond surface-level assumptions." Ward's expression sharpened. "Systemic issues? Are you suggesting this case is about something more than a stolen car?" "I am," Malcolm said calmly, "because it is." A ripple went through the courtroom, prompting the judge to bang his gavel. "Order." Ward's smile thinned. "Dr. Hayes, isn't it true that you've made significant donations to organizations that advocate for criminal justice reform?" "Yes," Malcolm said without hesitation, "because I believe in fairness and accountability." "And isn't it also true," Ward continued, his voice rising slightly, "that your personal background might bias you against law enforcement?" Malcolm didn't flinch. "My background doesn't bias me. It informs me. I've seen what happens when power goes unchecked." Ward leaned forward, his tone turning sharper. "So you're saying you've already decided that the authorities in this case are in the wrong?" "I'm saying," Malcolm replied, his voice steady, "that the evidence in this case doesn't justify the charges against Devin Mitchell, and the way it's been handled raises serious questions about bias." Ward opened his mouth to retort, but the defense attorney stood. "Objection, Your Honor. The prosecution is badgering the witness." "Sustained," the judge said. "Mr. Ward, move on." As the day wore on, The tension in the courtroom thickened. By the time the proceedings adjourned for lunch, Malcolm could feel the weight of it pressing down on him. He stepped outside for air, but the respite was short-lived. Sheriff Branson and Deputy Nash were waiting near the steps. "You've got a lot to say in there," Branson remarked, his tone deceptively casual. Malcolm met his gaze. "I speak the truth. If that bothers you, maybe you should ask yourself why." Branson's smile faded, replaced by a harder edge. "You think you're making a difference, but all you're doing is stirring up trouble." Malcolm stepped closer, his voice low but firm. "If trouble means standing up for what's right, then I'll take it every time." The sheriff's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Charles appeared at Malcolm's side. "Something wrong here?" the pastor asked, his presence a quiet but undeniable force. Branson glared at them both, before turning and walking away, Nash trailing behind him. The tension reached its breaking point that afternoon. As Malcolm prepared to leave the courthouse, his phone buzzed with a message from Carla Mitchell. "They're coming after Devin." Malcolm's heart sank. He hurried to his car, scanning the street for signs of trouble. When he arrived at the Mitchell home, the scene was chaos. Police cars lined the street, their lights flashing. A small crowd had gathered, their voices raised in protest as officers escorted Devin out of the house in handcuffs. "What's going on here?" Malcolm demanded, pushing through the crowd. Branson was standing near the patrol car, his expression smug. "New evidence came to light," he said. "Devin's being taken in for questioning." Malcolm's voice rose. "Questioning? On the eve of his hearing? This is intimidation, plain and simple." Branson smirked. "Call it what you want, Hayes. We call it justice." Malcolm stepped closer, his frustration boiling over. "You're making a mockery of justice and you know it." The crowd murmured in agreement, their anger palpable. Branson's expression darkened. "Careful, Hayes. You're walking a fine line." "So are you," Malcolm shot back. "And when you cross it, you'll find out just how thin that line really is." Devin's mother sobbed openly as the teenager was placed in the back of the patrol car. Malcolm turned to her, his voice gentle but firm. "I won't let this stand, Carla, I promise." As the police cars pulled away, the crowd surged with anger and fear. Malcolm felt the weight of their expectations pressing down on him. This wasn't just about Devin anymore, it was about every person in Redford who had been silenced, humiliated, or ignored. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. When the voice on the other end answered, he spoke quickly. "It's Malcolm, I need your help now." The street outside the Mitchell home was a simmering cauldron of tension. Protesters, neighbors, and curious onlookers crowded the scene as Malcolm paced near his car, his phone pressed to his ear. The flashing red and blue lights from the police vehicles had faded, but their oppressive presence lingered, leaving behind an electrified atmosphere. Carla Mitchell was slumped on the curb, her hands trembling as she clutched her phone. She had stopped crying, but stared into the distance, her face frozen in disbelief. "They've taken him," Malcolm said into his phone, his voice low and urgent. "This was deliberate. Branson's playing the game dirty, and Devin is the pawn." On the other end of the line, Jasmine Carter, one of Malcolm's longtime allies and a civil rights attorney, was silent for a beat. Then her voice came through, sharp and clear. "They're trying to rattle everyone before the hearing tomorrow. The arrest was designed to intimidate the Mitchells, and anyone else thinking of standing against them." Malcolm ran a hand over his face, exhaling through his nose. "What are Devin's options? Can we stop this before it goes too far?" "We can try," Jasmine said, her voice clipped. "But it's Branson. He knows how to manipulate the system to buy himself time. We need leverage evidence, something that makes him act fast or makes the public put the pressure on." Malcolm looked around at the crowd, at the simmering frustration and anger. These weren't just witnesses, they were allies, potential leverage. "Jasmine, I think I have an idea." Inside the town hall later that evening, the tension had reached a boiling point. Malcolm stood at the front of the small assembly room, facing a crowd of 50 people. Neighbors, community leaders, and activists who had answered his call. Pastor Charles stood to his left, arms crossed, his towering frame lending an air of gravity to the proceedings. The room buzzed with low murmurs of unease. Malcolm held up a hand, commanding silence. When he spoke, his voice was calm, but carried a steel edge. Tonight, we're not just talking about Devin Mitchell, he began. We're talking about a system that has spent decades taking advantage of people like him, like us. This isn't new, but it's become bold, too bold. And it's time we push back. The crowd erupted into applause, but Malcolm raised his hand again, silencing them. Branson and his allies want us to believe this is inevitable, that no matter how hard we fight, the outcome is already decided. But they're wrong. They're wrong, because they're afraid. A voice from the back called out, "Afraid of what?" Malcolm stepped forward, his eyes scanning the crowd. "Afraid of what happens when we stop being quiet, when we stop letting them manipulate the narrative, when we hold them accountable in ways they can't ignore." The murmurs turned to nods of agreement. Malcolm continued, his voice rising. "Tomorrow, we show them what accountability looks like, and it starts by making our voices louder than their lies. It starts by flooding that courthouse with witnesses, supporters, and allies. If they think we're going to sit back and let them take Devin, they're in for a rude awakening." The crowd erupted again, but this time the energy was different, charged with determination rather than despair. After the meeting, Pastor Charles caught up with Malcolm near the door. "You've rallied them," he said, his tone cautious. "But be careful, Branson's not the kind of man to go down without a fight." "I know," Malcolm said, his jaw tightening. "But neither am I." The following morning, the courthouse was surrounded by a crowd that dwarfed the one from the day before. Protesters held signs calling for justice for Devin Mitchell, their chants echoing off the stone facade. Reporters swarmed the scene, cameras trained on the growing spectacle. Inside, the courtroom was standing room only. Malcolm sat in the front row next to Carla Mitchell, who clutched a photograph of Devin as a young boy. Her face was pale, but resolute. Branson arrived late, striding into the courtroom with a swagger that made Malcolm's stomach turn. He exchanged a smirk with Ward at the prosecution's table, his confidence unshaken. But Malcolm could see the cracks, subtle, fleeting moments of hesitation that betrayed the pressure he was under. As the judge entered and the proceedings began, Ward wasted no time presenting the new evidence that had led to Devin's arrest, a blurry surveillance photo of someone in a hoodie near the scene of the alleged theft. It was flimsy at best, but Ward played it up as a smoking gun. Malcolm clenched his fists under the table. This wasn't justice, it was theater, designed to obscure the truth with enough plausible deniability to sway the jury. But as Ward continued, Malcolm noticed something else. Branson's expression had shifted. He looked nervous. During the lunch recess, Malcolm pulled Jasmine aside near the courthouse steps. "There's something off about Branson," he said. "He's usually smug, but today he looks like he's hiding something." Jasmine frowned. "What do you think it is?" "I don't know," Malcolm said. "But we need to find out." Jasmine glanced toward the courthouse. "I'll make some calls, see what I can dig up. But be careful, if Branson feels cornered, he might do something reckless." As Jasmine walked away, Malcolm turned back to the crowd. The chants had grown louder, and reporters jostled for sound bites from protesters. Among them, Malcolm spotted Pastor Charles, who gave him a small nod of encouragement. But then, something unexpected happened. A commotion erupted near the back of the crowd as a young man in a hoodie pushed through the throng, his face pale and his movements frantic. He stumbled onto the courthouse steps, clutching a manila envelope. "I have evidence," he shouted, his voice cracking. "I have proof Devin didn't do it." The crowd fell silent, as the young man, no older than 20, was quickly intercepted by security. Malcolm pushed through to reach him. "What do you have?" Malcolm asked, keeping his voice calm despite the adrenaline surging through him. The young man handed him the envelope, his hands shaking. "I saw them plant it," he said. "The evidence they're using against Devin, I saw Branson's deputy put it in the car." Malcolm's heart pounded as he opened the envelope. Inside were photos, clear, undeniable images of Deputy Nash placing the stolen items into the trunk of Devin's car. There was also a typed note. "They can't keep getting away with this." "Who gave you this?" Malcolm asked. The young man hesitated. "I can't say, they'll come after me if they know." Malcolm looked into the young man's eyes, seeing the fear there, but also the courage. He placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. "You've done the right thing, we'll take it from here." As Malcolm turned to Jasmine, who had returned just in time to see the exchange, his resolve hardened. "Get this to the judge immediately," he said. "We've got them." The courtroom was a storm of tension when the proceedings resumed. As the judge reviewed the evidence Malcolm and Jasmine had presented, Branson's composure finally cracked. His face turned a deep shade of red as he leaned over to whisper furiously with Ward. The judge slammed his gavel, his voice booming. "Order in the court!" Malcolm sat back, his pulse pounding as he watched the scene unfold. Branson and Ward were visibly unraveling, their confidence replaced by desperation. But just as Malcolm felt a surge of hope, Branson stood abruptly. "Your Honor," he said, his voice tight with barely restrained fury. "This evidence is inadmissible, it's clearly fabricated." The judge frowned. "Sheriff, you are out of line." "Am I?" Branson shot back, his voice rising. "This is a witch hunt, orchestrated by people who don't understand the pressures of law enforcement. They'll say and do anything to discredit us." The crowd murmured in disbelief, but the judge silenced them with another bang of his gavel. "Sheriff, if you have any evidence to back up your claim, present it. Otherwise, I suggest you sit down." Branson's mouth opened, then closed, his bluster deflated. Malcolm locked eyes with him, the weight of everything unsaid hanging in the air. This wasn't over. Not yet. The courtroom crackled with a tense, almost electric energy. Malcolm Hayes sat upright, his eyes locked on Sheriff Branson, who was no longer attempting to conceal his frustration. The judge's chambers had been closed to the public for this emergency evidentiary hearing, but the stakes felt higher than ever. Seated to Malcolm's left was Jasmine Carter, her laptop open as she prepared to present the damning evidence brought forward earlier that day. Across the table, Branson and Ward exchanged hurried whispers, their confidence slipping away like sand through fingers. The photographs and testimony from the young man, identified only as a whistleblower, had thrown them into disarray. "Sheriff Branson," the judge said, his tone heavy with skepticism, "the court requires an explanation for the actions depicted in these photographs. Were you aware of Deputy Nash's alleged tampering with evidence?" Branson cleared his throat, his voice lacking its usual swagger. "Your Honor, I can assure you, this is a misunderstanding. These photographs could have been doctored." "That's not what I asked," the judge interrupted, his sharp tone cutting through Branson's excuses. "Were you aware of this conduct? Yes or no?" Malcolm felt a flicker of satisfaction as Branson hesitated, the weight of his lies pressing visibly against him. But before he could respond, Ward stood, attempting to redirect the focus. "Your Honor, the sheriff's impeccable record speaks for itself," Ward said smoothly. "This so-called evidence comes from an unnamed source with questionable credibility. We would request a continuance to properly examine." "That won't be necessary," Jasmine interjected, standing with a commanding presence. "Your Honor, we've already had the photographs authenticated by an independent forensics expert, and as you'll see, the timestamps match perfectly with the prosecution's evidence log." She handed a folder to the bailiff, who delivered it to the judge. As he reviewed the documents, Malcolm watched Branson squirm, his face a patchwork of barely concealed rage and fear. "This is ridiculous," Branson muttered, but the words lacked the conviction they once carried. Malcolm could see it clearly now, the unraveling of a man who had relied on unchecked power for far too long. As the hearing stretched into the afternoon, the showdown Malcolm had anticipated finally arrived. The judge leaned forward, fixing Branson with a piercing glare. "Sheriff," he said, "the court is inclined to believe that the evidence provided here today demonstrates serious misconduct within your department. Do you have any rebuttal?" Branson stood, his hands gripping the edge of the table. For a moment, Malcolm thought he might crumble under the pressure. Instead, he doubled down. "This is a witch hunt," Branson growled, his voice rising. "People like Hayes, people like them, come into our town and think they can tell us how to do our jobs. They don't understand what it takes to keep order, to maintain respect." The room fell deathly silent. Malcolm could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, the unspoken prejudice dripping from Branson's words. It was as if the sheriff had finally torn off the mask he'd worn for years, revealing the ugliness beneath. Malcolm stood slowly, his movements deliberate. He straightened his blazer and turned to face Branson directly. "Sheriff," he said, his voice calm but firm, "what people like me understand is that respect isn't something you demand with a badge or a gun. It's something you earn by serving the people you're sworn to protect, and what you've shown today is that you care more about power than justice. Branson's face darkened, his fists clenching at his sides. You don't know anything about this town, he spat. You left, remember? You got your fancy degrees, your big paycheck, and now you think you're better than us. Malcolm took a step closer, his composure unshaken. I left because men like you made it impossible for people like me to stay, but I came back because no one, especially not a corrupt sheriff, gets to decide who belongs here. The tension in the room was suffocating. Branson opened his mouth to respond, but the judge intervened. That's enough, he said, his voice carrying the authority that Branson's lacked. He turned to Ward. Counsel, I would strongly advise your client to reconsider his strategy. This court is not inclined to tolerate baseless accusations or thinly veiled threats. Ward nodded quickly, his face pale. Understood, Your Honor. As the hearing concluded, the judge announced that the charges against Devin Mitchell were to be reviewed in light of the new evidence, effectively delaying the trial and ensuring Devin's release from custody. Carla Mitchell let out a sob of relief, clutching Malcolm's arm as tears streamed down her face. But Malcolm's victory felt incomplete. Branson and his deputy had been exposed, but their removal from power was far from guaranteed. As he left the courthouse, the crowd outside erupted into cheers, their faith in Malcolm a bright light against the lingering shadow of injustice. That evening, Malcolm sat in his living room, the weight of the day pressing heavily on his shoulders. Jasmine was seated across from him, her laptop open as she drafted a formal complaint to the state's attorney general. We need to push this higher, she said, her tone resolute. Branson's influence is waning, but we can't let him regroup. The AG's office needs to investigate the entire department. Malcolm nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. He's going to push back harder, he said. Men like him always do. Jasmine looked at him, her expression softening. That's why we don't stop. You've made it this far, Malcolm. We can't let up now. As Jasmine spoke, Malcolm's phone buzzed. The message was from an unknown number. You've made your point, back off while you still can. He showed the message to Jasmine, who frowned deeply. They're getting desperate, she said. That's a good thing. Or it means we're in more danger than ever, Malcolm replied. Jasmine closed her laptop and leaned forward. Danger or not, we've got them cornered tomorrow. We file the complaint, and we keep fighting. Malcolm met her gaze, his resolve hardening. Tomorrow, he said. We finish this. The courthouse parking lot was quiet under the fading evening light, but Malcolm Hayes knew the calm was deceptive. The crowd of supporters and protesters had dispersed hours ago, leaving behind an eerie silence that felt more oppressive than the earlier chaos. He stood near his car, scrolling through his phone as Jasmine coordinated next steps over a call from inside the courthouse. The text message from the unknown number, "Back off while you still can," remained fresh in his mind. Malcolm's instincts told him that Branson wasn't finished. A man like him didn't slink away quietly, not after years of unchecked power. The sheriff would lash out, and Malcolm had to be ready. The sound of heavy boots crunching against gravel broke the silence, pulling Malcolm's attention. He looked up to see Sheriff Branson striding toward him, his expression dark and purposeful. Behind him, Deputy Nash hung back, his unease evident in the way his hand hovered near his holstered weapon. "Evening, Hayes," Branson said, his voice low and menacing. Malcolm didn't flinch. "Sheriff, shouldn't you be figuring out how to explain your department's misconduct to the state?" Branson smirked, but there was no humor in it. "You think you're clever, don't you? Coming back here, stirring things up, making yourself the hero?" Malcolm's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "It's not about me, it's about holding people like you accountable." Branson took a step closer, his posture radiating aggression. "Accountable. You don't know the first thing about what it takes to run a town like this. People respect me because I keep order. You wouldn't last a day in my shoes." "Order?" Malcolm repeated, his tone sharp. "You call planting evidence and terrorizing a teenager order. You call abusing your badge respect. That's not leadership, Sheriff. That's cowardice." Branson's face reddened, his composure cracking. "You don't get to talk to me like that," he growled, his hand clenching into a fist. "Or what?" Malcolm asked, stepping forward to close the gap between them. "You'll throw me in jail too. Manufacture some charges like you did with Devin. Go ahead, Branson, show everyone who you really are." For a moment, Branson froze, his bravado faltering under the weight of Malcolm's challenge. Nash shifted uncomfortably in the background, his eyes darting between the two men. The tension was suffocating. Then Branson leaned in, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You think you've won, but you haven't. I've got friends in high places, Hayes people who won't think twice about shutting you down." Malcolm's eyes burned with defiance. "And I've got the truth on my side." "You're scared, Branson, because you know you've lost control. The lies, the corruption, it's all coming out. And when it does, your friends won't be able to save you." Branson's smirk returned, but it was strained. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, holding it out to Malcolm. "This isn't over," he said, his tone venomous. "You've got one chance to walk away. Take it." Malcolm unfolded the paper and scanned its contents. It was a thinly veiled threat, evidence of a decades-old dispute involving Malcolm's late mother, twisted and manipulated to paint her in a bad light. The implication was clear. Branson was willing to tarnish the Hayes family's name if Malcolm didn't back down. "You're desperate," Malcolm said, crumpling the paper in his hand. "And that's why you're going to lose." Branson's mask of confidence slipped, replaced by unfiltered rage. He lunged forward, but before he could get too close, Nash stepped between them, his voice sharp. "Sheriff, that's enough." The sudden interruption caught both men off guard. Branson glared at Nash, his voice dripping with disdain. "What the hell are you doing?" Nash swallowed hard, his gaze flicking to Malcolm. "This isn't worth it, Sheriff. Let's go." Branson stared at his deputy, betrayal flashing in his eyes. "You're either with me or against me, Kyle." "I'm not going down with you," Nash said, his voice steadier now. "Not for this." Malcolm watched the exchange, his mind racing. Nash's wavering allegiance was an opportunity. A crack in Branson's armor that could be exploited. The sheriff took a step back, his face twisted with fury. "You're making a mistake," he hissed, before turning on his heel and storming toward his car. Nash hesitated for a moment, then followed, his shoulders slumped. Malcolm stood rooted in place, the crumpled paper still in his hand. The confrontation had ended, but the battle was far from over. That night, Malcolm and Jasmine met at her office to strategize. The photographs and testimony were powerful, but they needed more to ensure Branson's removal and the department's overhaul. Nash's sudden defiance provided a glimmer of hope. "We need him to flip," Jasmine said, her fingers tapping against her keyboard. "If Nash testifies against Branson, it could seal the deal." Malcolm nodded. "He's scared, and that makes him vulnerable. But we have to handle this carefully. If Branson gets wind of it, Nash won't make it out unscathed." Jasmine glanced at her phone. "I can reach out to some contacts in internal affairs. If Nash cooperates, they can protect him." As they worked late into the night, the weight of the confrontation lingered in Malcolm's mind. Branson's threat against his family was a new low, but it only strengthened his resolve. He wasn't just fighting for Devin Mitchell or the town of Redford. He was fighting to dismantle a system that had oppressed generations. The next morning, Malcolm received an unexpected call. It was Nash. "Dr. Hayes," the deputy said, his voice strained. "Can we meet somewhere private?" Malcolm's pulse quickened. "Of course, name the place." They met in a secluded park on the edge of town, the early morning fog casting an eerie stillness over the scene. Nash looked worn, his usual bravado replaced by a nervous energy. "I'm done," he said without preamble. "I can't keep covering for him." Malcolm studied Nash's face, searching for sincerity. "Why now?" Nash exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Because it's gone too far. Branson thinks he's untouchable, but I can't be a part of it anymore. Planting evidence, threatening witnesses, it's not what I signed up for." Malcolm nodded slowly. "If you testify, you'll be risking everything. Are you ready for that?" Nash hesitated, then nodded. "If it means taking him down, I'll do it." Malcolm extended a hand. "Then let's do this together." The stakes had never been higher. With Nash's cooperation, Malcolm and Jasmine prepared for the final showdown. Branson's corruption was on the verge of being exposed, but the fight wasn't over. The uncertainty of what lay ahead loomed large, but Malcolm knew one thing for sure. This was a battle worth fighting, no matter the cost. The morning of the final hearing arrived with a sense of charged anticipation. The courthouse was surrounded by an even larger crowd than before, a diverse gathering of protesters, community members, and media signs, reading "Justice for Devin" and "Accountability for All" were raised high, their messages amplified by chants that echoed down Redford's narrow streets. Inside, the courtroom was packed to capacity. The air buzzed with the weight of what was about to unfold. Sheriff Branson sat at the defense table, his face set in a mask of defiance, but the cracks in his confidence were visible to anyone paying attention. Malcolm Hayes, seated near the front, exchanged a glance with Jasmine Carter. She gave him a small nod, signaling that everything was in place. The proceedings began with the judge addressing the new evidence and Nash's decision to testify. As the deputy was called to the stand, the tension in the room became almost suffocating. Malcolm watched closely, knowing this moment could make or break the case. Deputy Nash took a deep breath before speaking, his hands gripping the edges of the witness stand as if to steady himself. "I've served under Sheriff Branson for years," he began, his voice steady but low. "At first, I thought he was just a tough leader, someone who demanded respect. But over time, I realized it was more than that. He didn't want respect. He wanted control." Nash paused, the weight of his confession hanging in the air. "I saw him manipulate evidence, intimidate witnesses, and target people who couldn't fight back. The Mitchell case was the last straw. I was there when he told me to plant the stolen items in Devin Mitchell's car." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Branson's attorney immediately stood to object, but the judge silenced him with a raised hand. "You'll have your chance, Counselor. Continue, Deputy Nash." Nash nodded, his voice growing stronger. "Devin didn't steal that car. Branson wanted to make an example of him. To send a message, I followed orders because I was afraid of losing my job, but I can't stay silent anymore." As Nash's testimony unfolded, the full extent of Branson's corruption came to light. He detailed years of misconduct, implicating not just the sheriff, but others in the department who had turned a blind eye. By the time he stepped down from the stand, the room was buzzing with shock and outrage. The judge didn't hesitate. "Based on the overwhelming evidence presented today, this court finds sufficient grounds to dismiss all charges against Devin Mitchell. Furthermore, I am recommending an immediate investigation into the conduct of Sheriff Branson and the Redford Police Department." The gavel struck, signaling the end of the hearing, but the consequences were only beginning. Branson stood abruptly, his face a mix of anger and desperation. "This is a setup," he shouted, pointing a finger at Malcolm. "You think you've won, but you don't know how deep this goes." His outburst only solidified the courtroom's opinion. Two internal affairs officers approached Branson, their expressions stern. "Sheriff Branson, you're under investigation for gross misconduct and abuse of power. Please come with us." For a moment, it looked like Branson might resist, but then his shoulders slumped. The once powerful man was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, his reign finally over. Outside, the crowd erupted into cheers as word of Branson's downfall spread. Reporters scrambled to capture statements from key players, but Malcolm avoided the cameras. Instead, he stepped aside to speak with Carla Mitchell, who was clutching Devin tightly, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You saved my son." Malcolm placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Devin saved himself by standing strong, and so did you. I just helped shine a light on the truth." Nearby, Pastor Charles was addressing a group of community members, urging them to stay vigilant and continue pushing for systemic change. Jasmine joined Malcolm, her expression a mix of exhaustion and triumph. "We did it," she said, "but this is just the beginning." Malcolm nodded. Branson was a symptom of a bigger problem. Now we have to make sure the system that allowed him to thrive is dismantled. Later that evening, Malcolm returned to his childhood home, the quiet of the house a stark contrast to the day's events. He sat on the porch with his father's old journal, flipping through the pages of handwritten notes and sketches. His mother's fight for justice had been the foundation of his own journey, and as he read her words, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The confrontation with Branson had tested Malcolm in ways he hadn't anticipated. It had forced him to confront not just the systemic issues he'd spent his career fighting, but also his own fears and doubts. He had faced the weight of a corrupt system and emerged stronger, more determined to create lasting change. The weeks that followed saw a wave of repercussions. With Branson removed from power, an interim sheriff was appointed, tasked with implementing reforms and rebuilding trust within the community. Internal Affairs launched a full-scale investigation into the department, uncovering a web of misconduct that stretched far beyond Branson's actions. Devin Mitchell returned to school, his name cleared, but his experience leaving a lasting impact. He began speaking at community events, sharing his story, and inspiring others to stand up against injustice. Carla, too, became an outspoken advocate, her quiet strength transformed into a powerful voice for change. Malcolm, meanwhile, received an outpouring of support from across the state. His actions had not only exposed corruption, but also ignited a broader conversation about accountability and the role of power in law enforcement. Despite the victory, Malcolm knew the work was far from over. The systemic issues that had enabled Branson's abuse would take years to dismantle, and the fight for justice would require constant vigilance. But for the first time in a long time, Malcolm felt hopeful. As he sat on the porch one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Jasmine joined him, a stack of folders in her hand. "More cases," she said, handing him one. "People are coming forward, asking for help." Malcolm took the folder, flipping it open to reveal a familiar story. A family targeted, evidence manipulated, justice denied. He sighed, the weight of the work ahead settling on his shoulders. "You ready to keep fighting?" Jasmine asked, her tone light but serious. Malcolm looked out at the fading light, his resolve steady. "Always." The story ended not with perfect resolution, but with a sense of progress. Malcolm's journey had been one of resilience and determination, and while the challenges ahead were daunting, he had proven that change was possible. The fight for justice was far from over, but the foundation had been laid, and Malcolm Hayes would be there, every step of the way. The golden hues of the sunset bathed the porch of Malcolm Hayes's childhood home, casting long shadows across the worn wooden steps. He sat with a steaming cup of coffee in his hand, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The day had been long, but it carried with it the sense of a battle fought and won. The events of the past weeks had changed him, not in ways that left scars, but in ways that deepened his purpose and sharpened his resolve. Malcolm Hayes had always been a fighter. It was in his blood, instilled by his mother's determination and his father's quiet strength. But this fight had been different. It had demanded that he revisit wounds he thought had long healed, that he confront the very foundation of the town that shaped him. In exposing Sheriff Branson's corruption, Malcolm had not only helped Devin Mitchell, but also taken a stand for everyone who had been silenced, overlooked, or oppressed in Redford. Yet the victory was bittersweet. The systemic issues Branson represented would not disappear overnight. The fight had illuminated Malcolm's path forward, not as a single battle to be won, but as a movement to sustain. Reflecting on his journey, Malcolm realized the greatest growth he had experienced was not in his resilience, he'd always had that, but in his belief that change was possible. He had seen the seeds of transformation take root, in the courage of people like Nash, who had chosen the truth over fear, in Devin's resolve to reclaim his dignity, and in the community's united voice, demanding accountability. Malcolm had faced moments of doubt, fear, and anger. He had confronted threats to his family's legacy and his own safety. But through it all, he had learned that justice required more than courage. It required unwavering persistence and the willingness to stand firm, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. The events in Redford were not isolated. They were part of a larger story unfolding across the nation, a story of communities grappling with systems designed to protect the powerful while marginalizing the vulnerable. Branson's fall was a microcosm of a much deeper issue: the abuse of power by those sworn to serve and protect. The case against Branson revealed how deeply systemic corruption could burrow, embedding itself in institutions meant to uphold justice. It also demonstrated the insidious nature of prejudice, not always overt, but woven into the fabric of everyday interactions, until someone had the courage to pull at the threads. Malcolm understood that Branson's downfall, while significant, was only the beginning. The investigation into the Redford Police Department would likely uncover more misconduct, and it was up to the community to demand lasting reforms. Policies would need to change, leadership would need to be rebuilt, trust would need to be earned. But Malcolm also saw hope in the ripple effects of this fight. The crowd outside the courthouse, the voices raised in protest, the bravery of people like Nash and Devin, these were signs that the community was ready to confront its past and build a better future. Redford was no longer content to accept the status quo. The story of Malcolm Hayes and the fight for justice in Redford serves as a reminder of the power of resilience and collective action. It shows that change often starts with a single voice, but gains strength when others join in. It challenges us to consider our own role in the fight against injustice. Will we stand silent in the face of wrongdoing, or will we speak out, even when it's uncomfortable or dangerous? Malcolm's journey underscores that progress is rarely linear. There are setbacks, moments of doubt, and times when the weight of the struggle feels unbearable. But it is in those moments that character is forged and movements are born. This story also invites reflection on the systems we inhabit. It asks us to question who holds power, how that power is wielded, and what we can do to ensure accountability. While the road to justice is long and fraught with challenges, stories like Malcolm's remind us that every step forward matters. As the sun dipped lower, Malcolm's phone buzzed with a message. It was from Devin Mitchell. "Thank you for believing in me. I want to help others the way you helped me." A small smile tugged at Malcolm's lips. He responded simply, "Keep moving forward. You're stronger than you know." Setting the phone aside, Malcolm turned his attention back to the horizon Jasmine Carter had left earlier, files in hand, to continue preparing cases for the state's attorney general. Pastor Charles had stopped by briefly, leaving Malcolm with a heartfelt prayer and the reassurance that the community would remain vigilant. Malcolm thought of his mother, of the battles she had fought in this very town, and he felt a quiet pride in continuing her legacy. He also thought of his daughter, Olivia, whose fiery passion for social justice gave him hope for the next generation. There was still so much work to be done. Malcolm knew that the road ahead would not be easy. There would be more Bransons, more battles, more moments that tested his resolve, but he also knew he wasn't alone. The people of Redford had proven their capacity to stand together, and that gave him strength. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared, Malcolm stood and walked inside. The fight was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, he felt ready for whatever came next. To those who have followed Malcolm's story, let it serve as a call to action. Speak out against injustice, even when it feels risky. Hold those in power accountable, even when it seems impossible. And most importantly, believe in the power of collective voices to create lasting change. The story of Redford is a story of hope, resilience, and the unyielding pursuit of justice. It is a reminder that progress is possible, not because it's easy, but because it's necessary. As Malcolm Hayes would say, "Keep moving forward. You're stronger than you know."